How could our most important financial institutions hold so much bad debt without anybody doing anything about it? Well, the truth is a lot of people saw the problem. And had others acted on what they said, we wouldn't be here right now. Here again is Chief White House Correspondent Bret Baier.
In April 2001, during the Bush administration's first year, the White House saw danger on the horizon. In their budget request for the following year, the administration recognized Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were, quote, a potential problem, and noted that if either were in trouble, it could, quote, cause strong repercussions in financial markets. But the markets had reeled when the dot-com bubble burst, and then they were hit hard by 9/11. Few wanted to hear gloomy talk about what seemed to be the one bright spot in the economy, the boom in real estate prices. By 2002, one powerful voice, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, was starting to send up flares.
When housing prices start to go up 10, 15, 20% a year, you know that just can't last.
Paul Gigot is the editorial page editor of the Journal, which was acquired by News Corp, the parent company of Fox News, in 2008.
You add that to these institutions, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which channeled so much money from abroad into housing because investors could channel some of their savings into these mortgage-backed securities where they got a really nice deal because they got a nice yield. So they loved channeling money into these instruments, and that flowed right into the housing market.
And few in Washington, on Wall Street, or along Main Street wanted to hear about the risks.
They had so much political support, both in Washington, because the members of Congress were bathed in their campaign contributions, and they loved all that support from Fannie and Freddie, and then from Wall Street as well, because Wall Street could sell those mortgage-backed securities guaranteed by Fannie Mae, guaranteed by the taxpayer, and they made terrific fees.
Gigot says that when the Journal tried to question what was happening in the mortgage market, he ran right into what he calls a Fannie Mae Freddie Mac buzzsaw.
I just remember one episode regarding the former CEO of Countrywide Financial, Angelo Mazzillo, and he got right into my face and started yelling at me and said, "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand the mortgage markets. You're in the pocket of the competitors of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac," and went on like that for a while. So it is an illustration of the degree to which people who were part of this mania didn't want anybody to say, "Are you sure this is the right way to go?"
They were thugs, and where you crossed them in any way, you got into trouble.
And you didn't have to be a journalist, says Peter Wallison, the former general counsel of the Treasury Department.
Well, I'm sure congressmen and senators were very afraid. There was a real question in my mind whether Congress controlled Fannie Mae or Fannie Mae controlled Congress.
A question underscored in 2003. The Bush administration nevertheless decided to take on the mortgage giants. It recommended significant regulatory changes, as then Treasury Secretary John Snow told the House Financial Services Committee more supervision was needed for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, known in Washington terms as government-supported enterprises, or GSEs.
We need a strong, world-class regulatory agency to oversee the prudential operations of the GSEs.
I think we see entities that are fundamentally sound financially. And
Democratic Representative Barney Frank was then the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee.
The more pressure there is there, then the less I think we see in terms of affordable housing.
Affordable housing. That was the primary concern of Democrats, even in the face of increasingly dire warnings about Fannie and Freddie.
The affordable housing that Congress really wanted was the housing that Democrats represented. And when Fannie and Freddie supported affordable housing by buying subprime and similar kinds of weak loans, they got a lot of political support from Congress.
In the meantime, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had begun cooking their books. That made the situation seem less risky than it actually was. It also allowed Fannie and Freddie executives to keep pocketing huge bonuses for their lending efforts. They were finally caught in 2004. Fannie Mae Chairman Franklin Raines, who had been appointed by President Clinton, stepped down. The Security and Exchange Commission is still investigating the accounting issues.
The accounting scandals were very important because what they did was convince some people, and some important people, that these were companies that really had to be watched. They were a threat. And one of those important people was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Alan Greenspan.
If we fail to strengthen GSE regulation, we increase the possibility of insolvency and crisis. We put at risk our ability to preserve safe and sound financial markets in the United States.
But Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac still had powerful defenders. For instance, Democratic Senator Charles Schumer of New York.
Things are good in the housing market. Why are people entertaining radical change?
Chuck Schumer would go to an area of the state of New York. He would get Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac to make loans in that area. What they knew was that political support from Chuck Schumer was a very important thing for them. That would protect their privileges in Congress.
Fannie and Freddie spread around the campaign contributions, too. Democratic Senator Christopher Dodd of Connecticut has been the biggest recipient of money from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac for the past 20 years, more than $165,000. And despite having been in the Senate only 3+ years, number 2 on that list, Barack Obama, with more than $126,000. The Republican who got the most donations, Utah Senator Robert Bennett, just under $108,000. For the record, Republican presidential nominee John McCain took $21,550. Fannie and Freddie's defenders stepped up big time in 2005 when the Bush administration renewed its call for action.
These large portfolios, unchecked in their growth over the last decade or so, pose a real problem.
The Senate Banking Committee adopted strong legislation which would have stopped Fannie and Freddie from acquiring these bad mortgages. All of the Republicans on the committee voted for it. All of the Democrats, including now Chairman Chris Dodd, voted against. But the Democrats were able to block a vote by the whole Senate.
None of the Democrats would support the bill that came out of the Senate Banking Committee. So a really tough bill that in 2005 could have actually prevented a lot of the problems we're seeing today, probably would have prevented the collapse of Fannie and Freddie.
In 2006, Senate Republicans introduced another bill to deal with the mushrooming problem. One of its sponsors, John McCain.
McCain made a statement on the floor of the Senate saying that it was necessary to adopt this bill. He's always been an opponent of what he called corporate welfare. And Fannie and Freddie were, I would say, the poster children for corporate welfare.
But once again, the votes went along party lines. Republicans for, Democrats against. With the Democrats in the majority, the bill failed. As 2006 turned into 2007, the housing bubble was starting to burst. Bad mortgages began to default. And as the defaults started to rise, the entire portfolio of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was questioned. And with the entire structure heading for collapse, plenty of politicians have come around to the view that GSEs were a major contributor to the crisis, especially after major financial institutions that had invested heavily in their subprime securities began to go under.
A lot of what we're dealing with today has its origins in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
The mismanagement of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which was made possible by weak oversight and little accountability.
What is tragic and lamentable is that the ensuing calamity was entirely foreseeable and preventable.
This hour, we've told you how for years Congress failed to pass tougher oversight for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That continuing lack of control allowed those two government-supported enterprises to keep pumping risky mortgage securities into our nation's financial system.